please be advised that there is material that will be presented that is not AA conference approved material. We believe that Joe and Charlie clearly state when they present material that is not AA conference approved material. The presentation has been color-coded to better assist you as to the origin of the information.
There is a solution. In this paragraph, we're going to see what happened to Bill. We're going to see about that personality change that took place in his life. We're going to see what we can do in order to receive what Bill received back in Bill's story.
In page 17 it says, "We of Alcoholics Anonymous." There's that big word again, we. Know thousands of men and women who were just as hopeless as Bill. Nearly all have recovered. They've solved the drink problem. Said we were average Americans. Well, today we're average citizens of the world. We've transcended all the lines of statehood and countries around the world. The last I heard, we were in 154 countries around the world. So all sections of this country and many of its occupations are represented, as well as many political, economic, social, and religious backgrounds. We are people who normally would not mix. But there exists among us a fellowship of friendliness and an understanding which is indescribably wonderful. We are people who normally would not mix. As I look around the rooms here today, I would say that we're probably the most mixed up group of people in Red Deer. We're people who normally would not mix. But there exists among us a fellowship and a friendliness which is indescribably wonderful. And you heard it before the meeting, all the talking and the laughing, and nobody listening, but we were talking and laughing. We're having a great time. And I got sober on the spirit of the fellowship. That's what kept me coming back, was the spirit of the fellowship, the love, the laughter, the talk.
Bill now begins to describe this friendliness, this understanding, this feeling we have for each other, by using an example of something we already know in order to teach us something new. All great writers have always done that. They use examples of what you already know to teach you something new. He said, "We are like the passengers of a great liner. The moment after rescue from shipwreck, when camaraderie, joyousness, and democracy pervade the vessel from the steerage to the captain's table." When this book was written back in 1937, 38, and 39, the way people traveled from one continent to another was on the great ocean liners, long before we had air travel as we have it today. On the great ocean liners, they had a distinct class system on it. Most of the immigrants that came to the United States, that came to Canada from Europe, most of them didn't have very much money. And it's way down in the bowels of the ship. No fresh air, dormitory-style living. I call it the cheese sandwich section. Not a very nice way to travel, but it didn't cost very much money. Now, if you wanted better accommodations, though, you could go for third class and come up a deck or two. And there you had a stateroom, you had a dining room you could eat in, and you could go outside and get plenty of fresh air. If that wasn't good enough, you could come up to second class, or you can come clear on up to first class. First class is way up on the top of the ship, the finest staterooms, the finest dining rooms, the finest food, the finest everything. But even in first class, that's still not where the elite people really think they belong. On first class, the most elite members of society, those that had the right kind of money.
Old money.
Old money.
No new money.
Those who had the right religion, those that had the right ethnic background, those that had the right everything, they might be invited to dine at the captain's table. And boy, the captain's table was the best place on the ship. Fine silverware, fine china, the best waiters, the best food, the best everything. Now, it was a long ways from the steerage section to the captain's table. Normally, the people wouldn't even meet each other. Those from the steerage would never meet those at the captain's table. In fact, they even had different stairwells so they couldn't accidentally run into each other. But he's got to be thinking now about the Titanic, still fresh on everybody's mind. And the night the Titanic hit the iceberg, these two guys are standing up here at the rail. One of them's from the steerage section. He's got on his old brogans, his old work overalls, and he's standing right next to a guy from the captain's table. And he's got on his tuxedo and his tie and his jewelry and all of his finery. And these two guys have nothing whatsoever in common with each other until they jump overboard. And when they jumped overboard and their butts hit that cold water, they had something in common. And I doubt very seriously if the man from the captain's table demanded a financial statement from the man from the steerage section. They grabbed onto each other, held onto each other, and those that were rescued, when they got back on another ship or got back on land, there was a feeling amongst them which was indescribably wonderful. And that's the great feeling we have for each other in AA. The feeling of having shared in a common peril. The feeling of having escaped from alcoholism is the thing that binds us together, and it's a wonderful and it's a great thing. But listen to him now. He now warns us. Unlike the feeling of the ship's passengers, however, our joint escape from disaster does not subside as we go our individual ways. These two guys got back on shore, and the disaster was over, and I imagine they looked at each other, and they said, well, we really don't belong together. And they separated and went their individual ways, probably never to see each other again. But our common disaster stays right outside the door. It's right out there in the parking lot, and it's very, very patient, and its name's called alcohol. And our feeling and escape from disasters does not subside as we go our individual ways, because we find each other in cities and towns and countries throughout the entire world. One of the greatest feelings people can have for each other is this great feeling of escape from the common disaster. The feeling of having shared in a common peril is one element in the powerful cement which binds us. One element in the powerful cement which binds us. But that in itself would never have held us together as we are now joined. The tremendous fact for every one of us is that we have discovered a common solution. We have a way out on which we can absolutely agree, and in which we can join in brotherly and harmonious action. This is the great news this book carries to those who suffer from alcoholism. The great news of this book is not the news of the fellowship, it's the news of the common solution. And later on we're going to see that the common solution is the vital spiritual experience which is brought about by the program of action of Alcoholics Anonymous. So on this page we talk about two powers. We talk about the power of the fellowship which supports us. We talk about the power of the common solution, the vital spiritual experience which changes us. And those two powers joined together can overcome our powerlessness over alcohol. But we really can't have one without the other. And I think one of the greatest tragedies in the world today, I see lots of tragedies all over the world. I think one of the greatest tragedies I see in the world today is that we people who are members of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, we are spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. We're spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men and women work hours trying to attract other alcoholics to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, when we've got thousands of people who are already members of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous who are sitting around in our meetings and dying from untreated alcoholism because they're doing nothing about the common solution. They're coming to meetings, they're enjoying the fellowship, but they're doing nothing about changing. And why aren't they doing something about changing? Because nobody's telling them to. Everybody's saying, just keep coming to meetings and you'll be okay. Come to 90 meetings in 90 days and everything will be fine. Come on in and we'll love you till you learn to love yourself. No, we need to say, man, you alcoholic just like we are. And you're going to enjoy this Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you're going to find strength and you're going to find power here, but that's not going to bring about recovery from alcoholism. Recovery is going to come through the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and through that you'll have a spiritual experience, and then you'll change, and then you'll recover. That's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to talk to it's our responsibility to tell the newcomer this. It's our responsibility to take them by the hand and lead them through the program so they can have the spiritual experience. Now, we said last night we wouldn't preach anymore, but this really is the last time we preach, Joe.
Well, maybe not the last time. Remember we said last night that sobriety through the practice and teaching of the 12 steps is the sole purpose of an AA group. That's what we're talking about here.
Every newcomer I work with, I take them, first I have them read the doctor's opinion. I make sure they understand it. I have them read Bill's story looking for identification, and we go through Bill's story together. Then I bring them to this page, and I sit down and I very, very carefully explain to them that we got two powers in here, and we got the power of the fellowship, and that's what we got here today. But that's not going to bring about recovery. We're going to have the spiritual experience. Now, a good book never tells you something that it doesn't explain itself. He's just told us that the fellowship alone is not enough. And he's going to use the first half of this chapter to explain to us why fellowship alone is not enough. Then he'll use the last half of this chapter to tell us what the common solution really is.
Let's go to page 20, please. First paragraph said, you may already have asked yourself why it is that so all of us became so very ill from drinking. Doubtless you are curious to discover how and why, in face of expert opinion to the contrary, we have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. Now, if you're an alcoholic who wants to get over it, you may already be asking, well, what do I have to do? It's the purpose of this book to answer such questions specifically. We'll tell you what we've done. Remember last night we talked about precise, specifically, with clear-cut directions. Here's one of those words. They're going to tell us specifically what they've done. Before going into detailed discussion, it may be well to summarize some points as we see them. How many times people have said to us, I can take it or leave it alone. Why can't he? Why don't you drink like a gentleman or quit? That fellow can't handle his liquor. Why don't you try beer and wine? Lay off the hard stuff. His willpower must be weak. He could stop if he wanted to. She's such a sweet girl, I think he'd stop for her sake. The doctor told him if he ever drank again, it would kill him. But there he is, all lit up again. Now these are commonplace observations on drinkers which we hear all the time. Back of them is a world of ignorance and misunderstanding. We see that these expressions refer to people whose reactions are very different from ours.
And we're going to talk about two drinkers that these expressions that Joe just read would refer to. First, moderate drinkers have little trouble in giving up liquor entirely if they have good reason for it. They can take it or leave it alone. We talked about them last night. They have a couple of drinks, they get a slightly tipsy, out of control beginnings of a nauseous feeling. If they have any trouble with alcohol, they can take it or leave it alone, period. It's not any problem for them. Those expressions that Joe read would refer to the moderate drinker. Then we have a certain type of hard drinker. He may have the habit badly enough to gradually impair him physically and mentally. It may cause him to die a few years before his time. If a sufficiently strong reason, ill health, falling in love, change of environment, or the warning of a doctor becomes operative, this man can also stop or moderate, although he may find it difficult and troublesome and may even need medical attention. We call this guy the heavy or the hard drinker. They drink like we alcoholics drink, but they're not alcoholic. If a good enough reason presents itself, they will learn to moderate their drinking. They do not have the physical allergy, or they will quit drinking entirely. They do not have the obsession of the mind. They drink like alcoholics, but they're not alcoholic. And you and I see them all the time. They're the ones that say, when I was in the service, I was an alcoholic also. But I got out of the service, and I got married and went to church and quit drinking, and I don't see why in the hell you can't. No, they're not alcoholic. They don't have the allergy. They don't have the obsession. But what about the real alcoholic? Now, he may start off as a moderate drinker. Many of us did. He may or may not become a continuous hard drinker. Many of us stayed periodic. But at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. Now, on the rest of page 21 into 22, we see the description of the real alcoholic. And as we go through it, if you find one there that fits you, would you please hold your hand up? We'd like to see if we're in a room full of real alcoholics.
Charlie talked last night about crossing over that line into alcoholism. Our book says, but at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. I don't know what line he was talking about when I was drunk when I went over it. I know that for sure. So here's a fellow who's been puzzling you, especially in his lack of control. He does absurd, incredible, tragic things while drinking. He's a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Anybody like that in here?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. He is seldom mildly intoxicated. He's almost more or less insanely drunk. Anybody like that?
His disposition while drinking resembles his normal nature but little. Always get good looking and out of debt when I start drinking. I had a fellow talk at our group here a while back, and I said, I know you from somewhere. I just can't put my finger on it. He's flat-bellied, all muscled up, good-looking guy. I said, I know where I saw you now. Every time I had 2 or 3 drinks, I looked just like you. Boy, he was good-looking.
He may be one of the finest fellows in the world. You let him drink for a day, and he frequently becomes disgustingly and even dangerously antisocial. I used to get meaner than hell when I drank. I was always picking a fight. Never did win one of them. Got the hell beat out of me every time. But I always went back and tried it again.
Couldn't lick his lips.
He has a positive genius for... He has a positive genius for getting tied at exactly the wrong moment, particularly when some important decision must be made or engagement kept. Anybody in here getting drunk at the wrong time?
He's often perfectly sensible and well-balanced concerning everything except liquor. But in that respect, he is incredibly dishonest and selfish. Anybody identify with that?
He often possesses special abilities, skills, and aptitudes, has a promising career ahead of him. He used his gifts to build up a bright outlook for his family and himself, and then pulls a structure down on his head by a senseless series of sprees. Anybody like that in here? You betcha.
He's a fellow who goes to bed so intoxicated that he ought to sleep the clock around. Yet early the next morning, he searches madly for the bottle he misplaced the night before.
Any bottle searchers in there?
If he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over his house to be certain no one gets his entire supply from him to throw down the waste pipe. My wife and I used to buy a lug of whiskey, that's 3/5, one to share and one to hide from each other.
As matters grow worse, he begins to use a combination of high-powered sedative and liquor to quiet his nerves so he can go to work. Then comes a day when he's simply not cut make it and gets drunk all over again. Perhaps he goes to a doctor who gives him morphine or some sedative to which to taper off. Then he begins to appear at hospitals and treatment centers, sanitariums.
Same thing.
Same thing, we just got a different name for him today. Now this is by no means a comprehensive picture of the true alcoholic, as our behavior patterns vary, but this description should identify him roughly. Now thank God today, if our respective governments have ever done anything right in the field of alcoholism, it's in education of the public as to what alcoholism is and what it isn't. And because of that, a lot of the stigma has been removed from alcoholism. Many people are getting to us today before they have to do all these things that identify the real alcoholic. But I'll guarantee you, if you're a real alcoholic, you found yourself in there somewhere. At least one of those are going to match you. In my case, almost every one of them, but one in particular. If he can afford it, he may have liquor concealed all over his house to be certain no one gets the entire supply away from him. About 6 or 7 years after I got sober, I sold a 40-acre, 40,000 broiler chicken operation. And for years after that, the guy that bought it, every once in a while I would run into him, and he would wave and grin, and he'd say, "Hey, Charlie, we have found another one." Referring to partially empty vodka bottles, behind corner posts, under rocks, in hollow trees, falling out of feed bins. Hell, he found them for years. Now here's the question. Why does he behave like this? If hundreds of experiences have shown him that one drink means another debacle with all its attendant suffering and humiliation, why is it he takes that one drink? Why can't he stay on the water wagon? The moderate drinker can, the heavy drinker can. Why can't the alcoholic? What has become of the common sense and willpower that he still sometimes displays with respect to other matters? Perhaps there never will be a full answer to these questions. Opinions vary considerably as to why the alcoholic reacts differently from normal people. We're not sure why. Once a certain point is reached, little can be done for him. We cannot answer the riddle. We know that while the alcoholic keeps away from drink, as he may do for months or years, he reacts much like other men. We're equally positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, something happens, both in the bodily and mental sense, which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. The experience of any alcoholic would abundantly confirm this. Now, these observations, the ones I just read, would be academic and pointless if our friend never took the first drink, thereby setting the terrible cycle in motion. Therefore, the main problem the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than in his body.
Would you say that again, please?
The main problem the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than in his body. Remember, just before we take the first drink, we are stone cold sober. No alcohol in our system at all. So the main problem centers in our mind, telling us we can drink, rather than in our body, which ensures that we can't drink. If you ask him why he started on it last bender, the chances are he'll offer you any one of 100 alibis. Sometimes the excuses have a certain plausibility, but none of them really make sense in the light of the havoc an alcoholic's drinking bout creates. They sound like the philosophy of the man who, having a headache, beats himself on the head with a hammer so that he can't feel the ache. If you draw this fallacious reasoning to the attention of an alcoholic, he will laugh it off or become irritated and refuse to talk. Once in a while, he may tell the truth. You know, strange as it may seem, there are times we alcoholics tell the truth. Not too often, but once in a while. I had an Al-Anon lady come to me one day and she said, "Charlie, all he does is lie, lie, lie." She said, "How can you tell when one of you guys are lying?" And I said, "Lady, watch him closely. And if you see his lips moving, he's probably lying to you, all right." And then I said, "You want me to tell you how to keep him from lying?" And she said, Yeah. I said, "Don't ask him those stupid questions." I said, "Hell, he don't know any more than you know." Now here's the truth. The truth, strange to say, he has no more idea what he took for first drink than you have. Some drinkers have excuses which are satisfied part of the time. They're in their hearts, they really do not know why they do it. Once this malady has a real hold, they are a baffled lot. Now here's the word obsession. There is the obsession that somehow, someday they will beat the game, but they often suspect they are down for the count. The great obsession of every alcoholic is someday, somehow, somewhere, we're going to find some kind of liquor we can drink without getting drunk. Someday, somehow, somewhere, we're going to find a place that we can go and drink without. Someday, somehow, somewhere, we're going to find a group of people we can drink with and not get drunk. And that idea is so strong that it makes us believe that we can drink. And we take a drink, and we end up drunk every time. So the real problem lies here in the mind, telling me I can drink, rather than the body that ensures that I can't drink. Let's go over to page 24, first paragraph, squiggly writing.
That's italic. The fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We're unable at certain times to bring into consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. We were without defense against the first drink. In other words, I have a wonderful memory. It's just short. I cannot remember the divorce court, can't remember the jailhouse, can't remember the car wreck. The only thing I can remember when I get ready to drink is what alcohol is going to do for me. I can't remember what alcohol has done to me. And see, alcohol can't do anything to me unless it does something for me. And we alcoholics, alcohol changes the way we think and the way we feel. It does marvelous things for me. And I was obsessed with the idea to drink. And even though it caused me an awful lot of problems, I couldn't remember the problems that it caused me. I could only remember what it was going to do for me.
And even if we did remember the problems it caused us, the mind would say, it's not going to do that to us this time.
This time it'll be different.
This time will be different.
There are almost certain consequences that follow taking even a glass of beer do not crowd into the mind to deter us. If these thoughts occur, they are hazy and readily supplanted with the old threadbare idea that this time we shall handle ourselves like other people. There is a complete failure of the kind of defense that keeps one from putting his hand on a hot stove.
If you've burned your hand on a hot stove badly, chances are you're always going to remember how that felt. Chances are you're never going to go back and put your hand on a hot stove to see if it'll burn you again. You know, I remember one time as a kid growing up back during the Depression years, we didn't have very much in those days. We didn't have hot and cold running water, and we didn't have forced air heat. If we had heat in the wintertime at all, we were lucky. We burned coal, we burned wood, we burned whatever we get our hands on.
Other people's houses, it didn't matter.
Yeah, Joe said in his neighborhood occasionally they'd burn somebody else's house to get warm. But it didn't make any difference how poor the family is. Cleanliness is still next to godliness. And everybody in the family had to take a bath on Saturday night. Now, whether you needed a bath or not's beside the point. You're still going to take one on Saturday night. And one night Mother had heated the old bath water on the old heating stove in the living room, put it in a number 3 zinc wash tub sitting behind that stove. Now, the oldest kid in the family takes their bath first. I'm the baby of the family. By the time he got to me, the crud would be about an inch thick on the water. And Mother said, get in there and get yourself clean. And I thought to myself, how in the hell do I get clean in there? But I didn't dare say that to her. You didn't talk to your mother that way. When I was a kid growing up, I scraped the crud back and I got in that wash tub full of water and I began to soap myself, and the old heating stove standing here red hot, and somehow I managed to lean over and stick my rear against that hot stove. I shall never forget it. It burned a blister on my rear end about as big as my hand, hurt me worse than anything had ever hurt me up to that time. And do you know, I've never had an obsession of mine to stick my ass on a hot stove since then. You betcha, I can remember today just exactly how that felt. But now alcohol has burned me over and over and over and over and over and over, just as bad as that hot stove ever burned me. And my mind can't remember that. Left on my own resources, I always start thinking about what alcohol is going to do for me, and I forget what it's going to do to me. And even if I remember what it does to me, my mind says, well, it won't do it that way this time, because we're just going to drink a half a pint, or we're just going to have 2 beers, or we're just going to... And I convince myself it's okay to drink. Now, if you go to the last paragraph on page 24, it says, when this sort of thinking is fully established in an individual with alcoholic tendencies, he's probably placed himself beyond human aid, and less locked up may die or go permanently insane. If we placed ourselves beyond human aid, then the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous will not bring about recovery, because the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous is made up of a bunch of human beings who are just as powerless as I am when it comes to alcohol. So if I'm going to recover, I'm going to have the aid of a power greater than human power. And on page 25, it says there is a solution.
He said there is a solution. And almost none of us likes the self-searching, the leveling of our pride, the confession of shortcoming, which the process requires for successful consummation. But we saw that it really worked in others, and we'd come to believe in the hopelessness and futility of life as we'd been living it. When therefore we were approached by those in whom the problem had been solved, there was nothing left for us but to pick up the simple kit of spiritual tools left at our feet. We have found much of heaven and have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence, of which we had not even dreamed. I'm like everybody else. When I come to AA, I didn't have any program to follow, but I stayed sober on the fellowship. The fellowship supported me until ultimately I could begin to work in on the steps. And I saw that it worked in them, and I came to believe that it might work for me. He said, the great fact is just this and nothing less, that we've had deep and effective spiritual experiences, which have revolutionized our whole attitude toward life, toward our fellows, toward God's universe. The central fact of our lives today is the absolute certainty that our Creator has entered in our hearts and lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. He has commenced to accomplish those things for us which we could never do by ourselves. You notice that little word up there says that we've had deep and effective spiritual experiences, has a little asterisk beside that. People began to write in to Bill and ask him what he meant by those terms, spiritual experience. And for a lot of people, they weren't having the same kind of experience that he was. And certainly when I read about spiritual experiences and spiritual awakenings, it conjured up a bunch of old ideas for me that I had as a young child, which I rejected even way back then. And I remember one time in my area they had a revival out back of my house, matter of fact. And my Aunt Much, big woman, Aunt Much, that's why they call her Aunt Much. Well, Aunt Much got into the spirit of this thing one night, and the next thing I know, she's talking in a strange language that I'd never heard of. Jumping up and down, seemed like she was jumping over those pews, running around in there. Got down on the ground, rolling around a little bit, speaking in strange language, scared the heck out of me. And she was having a spiritual experience. And when I read about spiritual experience in this book, I thought I was going to have one of those. And I was dreading it, to tell you the truth. But thank God for people like me and other people who wrote in and asked Bill what he meant by those terms. In the next printing of the book, he put that little asterisk there, and it says, fully explained on Appendix 2. Later on page 27, referring to the same asterisk, he said, for further information, see Appendix 2. And on page 47, referring to the asterisk, he said, please see Appendix 2. He referred to something 3 different times. It's probably important that I understand what he meant by those terms. And if I'm going to have a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening, it would be a good idea if I understood what they were. Because my understanding was that of a 7-year-old boy. When I come to Alcoholics Anonymous, I had the spiritual knowledge of a 7-year-old boy, which wasn't much. And I needed some different kinds of knowledge. And let's turn now, if you will, let's go back to page 569 in this book, and let's see what they meant by those terms, spiritual experience.
Most of us come here with preconceived ideas about what a spiritual experience is, just like we had preconceived ideas about the word allergy. In order for us to fully understand what he means, we'll have to see what their understanding of the word spiritual experience really is. And thank God he put the appendix in the back of the book so that we could see that it really doesn't have anything to do with religion at all. That's what really interested me when I finally could see what spiritual experience really is, Joe.
If the writer or the writers of this book are talking in terms that they understand about spiritual experiences, and I'm reading with my limited understanding, the message that's come through is going to be garbled and misunderstood by me. So I need to know what they meant by those terms. So here on page 569 it says spiritual experience. The terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which, upon careful reading, and we know that alcoholics don't do careful reading, show that the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many different forms.
Okay, in that first paragraph, I've already learned a couple of things. I've learned that it might be called a spiritual experience, or it might be called a spiritual awakening. And in either case, they result in a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. Our personality is made up by the way we think, by the way we feel, by our attitude and outlook upon life, people, places, and things in general. This sounds a lot like what Dr. Silkworth called a psychic change. So we could hear one of 4 terms: spiritual experience, spiritual awakening, personality change, or even psychic change, all meaning changing the way we think, the way we feel, ideas, and attitudes.
Dr. Jung told Roland ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were the guiding force of these lives, are suddenly cast to one side. That's what we're talking about. The spiritual experience is a sudden variety. Boom. Happened that way with Bill. The spiritual awakening developed slowly over a period of time. I do better as I know better. The educational variety. So yet it is true that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheaval. Happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. I was glad to hear that. In the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes are described. Though it was not our intention to create such an impression, many alcoholics have nevertheless concluded that in order to recover, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousness, followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. Among our rapidly growing membership of thousands of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent, are by no means the rule. Most of our experience is what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop slowly over a period of time. Quite often, friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he is himself. He finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life, that such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. What often takes place in a few months could seldom have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. With few exceptions, our members find they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. Most of us think this awareness of a power greater than ourselves is the essence of spiritual experience. Our more religious members call it God consciousness. Most emphatically, we wish to say that any alcoholic capable of honestly facing his problems in the light of our experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. He can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. We find that no one need have difficulty with the spirituality of the program. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. There is a principle which is a bar against all information, which is proof against all argument, which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance, and that principle is contempt prior to investigation. I knew so many things when I got here, that of a 7-year-old boy, spiritual-minded, that were not true. It was almost impossible for me to learn anything that was true. I needed an open mind so that I could learn things.
There seems to be one key word running through this entire appendix, and that's the word change. Now, Bill, like most writers, repeats himself quite often, but he also finds a different word which means the same thing when he repeats himself. Let's see how many times he said change on page 569 and how many ways he had of saying it. In the first paragraph, he called it a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism. In the second paragraph, in the first sentence, he again mentions personality changes, but then he said they will be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. A spectacular upheaval is to change something entirely. In the third paragraph, first sentence, he said sudden revolutionary changes. To revolutionize something is to change it entirely. Third paragraph, about the middle of the paragraph, he called it immediate and overwhelming God consciousness. To overwhelm something is to change it entirely. Third paragraph, last sentence, he called it a vast change in feeling and outlook. Fourth paragraph, first sentence, he said such transformations. To transform is to change. About the middle of the fourth paragraph, he called it a profound alteration. To alter is to change. So the key word in here is to change from what we were when we came here to something entirely different. We come here restless, irritable, and discontented. We come here filled with shame, fear, guilt, and remorse. We come here very selfish, self-centered human beings. We come here filled with fear, anger, intolerance, impatience, and etc. None of those are good personality habits. So if we can change from that to something entirely different, then we have undergone a change in our personality. And we can call it a spiritual experience, a spiritual awakening, a psychic change, a profound alteration, a transformation, or whatever we want to. And you'll notice none of those are religious terms. Has nothing to do with religion at all, period. And the only people that I ever see that fail in AA are those that absolutely refuse to change. And you see them once in a while. They want to stay sober, but they don't want to make any changes in their lifestyle. They don't want to make any changes in the way they think. They want to keep on doing the same old things they've always done, yet stay sober at the same time. And they're the ones that always go back to drinking. But any of us that are willing to do so, if we'll practice this simple kit of spiritual tools laid at our feet, the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, we can undergo this personality change sufficient to recover from alcoholism.
I like that idea about change. Remember, I said I stood at the back of the rooms and I stood up against the wall and I looked down at my feet and I was ashamed of what I'd become. And I like that idea about changing. I didn't like me. I wanted to change to be something else. So I looked around the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous and I picked me out some heroes. And we all have our heroes. We need our heroes. People we look up to and love and respect. Charlie was one of my heroes. I want to be just like Charlie. I almost made it. Thank God I didn't, but I almost made it. I tried hard enough. You see? But I think the type of change that we're really talking about is to change from what I had become to that which God intends for me to be. You see, that's the type of change that I'm talking about in AA. But I had to go through that trying to be like other people for a while. I needed my heroes. I needed the fellowship in order to stick around long enough so that I could begin to work these steps and to make that change. I'm not what I used to be, thank God. I'm different than what I used to be.
I knew him when he first came to AA. He's not what he used to be, I'll guarantee you. Let's go back to page 25. Last paragraph. If you're as seriously alcoholic as we were, we believe there is no middle-of-the-road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible, and if we had passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, we had but two alternatives. One was to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could.
Which is step one.
And the other to accept spiritual help.
Which is step two.
It says this we did because we honestly wanted to and were willing to make the effort. And one of the things I keep hearing in AA today, I hear people say you better not talk too much about God or you'll run the newcomer off. My old sponsor straightened me out on that years ago. He said, Charlie, you don't need to worry about running a newcomer off talking about God. He said, if you do, whiskey will put him right back in here every time. And I found that to be true. The big book doesn't mind talking about God at all. And it finally tells us we just got one or two choices. We can stay powerless over alcohol, continue to drink until we die, or we can accept spiritual help. And it seems as though we don't have any other choices, just those two.
No door three, just two.
Now we could see where the idea of step one came from Dr. Silkworth. He's the one that told us about the physical allergy, the obsession of the mind that made us powerless over alcohol. Now I'm always amazed when I see where step two came from. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. You would always have thought this idea of the spiritual experience would have come from somebody in religion. And I'm amazed to see where it came from. On page 26, there's a little story here we'll look at for just a moment. And it's the story of this fellow named Roland Hazard. He's one of the guys that interceded between Ebby and the judge. Let's look at Roland's story for just a moment.
He says, certain American businessmen had ability, good sense, and high character. For years he had floundered from one sanitarium to another. He had consulted the very best-known American psychiatrist. Then he'd gone to Europe, placing himself in the care of the celebrated physician, the psychiatrist Dr. Jung, who prescribed for him.
Now, Dr. Jung at that time was probably the third leading psychiatrist in the world. There was Dr. Freud, Dr. Adler, and Dr. Jung. Adler and Jung were both students of Dr. Freud, so he was amongst the three leading psychiatrists in the world at that time. This is back about 1929, 1930.
Though experience had made him skeptical, he'd finished his treatment with unusual confidence. His physical and mental condition was unusually good. Above all, he believed he had acquired such a profound knowledge of the inner workings of his mind and its hidden springs that relapse was unthinkable.
He didn't go to Dr. Jung for a 28-day treatment program. He went to Dr. Jung for a full year. They had a weekly session every week for a full year. And he thought he had such a profound knowledge of his mind now that he'd never have to drink again.
He said, nevertheless, he was drunk in a short time. As soon as he got out of the hospital, he started for the ship to come home and got drunk on the way to the ship from the hospital. More baffling still, he could not give himself no satisfactory explanation for his fall. So he returned to this doctor whom he admired, and he asked him point blank why he could not recover. He wished above all things to regain self-control. He seemed quite rational, well-balanced with respect to other problems, yet he had no control whatever over alcohol. Why was this? He begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth if he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to place himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. That was a great physician's opinion. And we think about Dr. Silkworth telling Roland this. Roland had been there for a year. He'd paid for his treatment, a lot of money back in those days. He knew he had plenty of money. He could have said to him, Roland, I think you have a Valium deficiency. You got plenty of money. Keep coming back and we'll treat you some more. But he didn't do that. He said, Roland, psychiatry and I have done all we can possibly do for you. Can't help you anymore. You're going to have to place yourself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if you expect to live long. This was his opinion.
But this man still lives, and he's a free man. He does not need a bodyguard, nor is he confined. He can go anywhere on this earth where other free men may go without disaster, provided he remains willing to maintain a certain simple attitude. Now, some of our alcoholic readers may think they can do without spiritual help. Let us tell you the rest of the conversation our friend had with his doctor. The doctor said, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I've never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you. Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had closed on him with a clang. He said to the doctor, is there no exception? Yes, replied the doctor, there is. Exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. They appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements.
Change.
Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side.
Change.
And a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them.
Change.
In fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement within you.
Change.
With many individuals, the methods which are employed are successful, but I've never been successful with an alcoholic of your description. Asterisk, bottom of the page, for amplification, see Appendix 2. They want to be sure that we understand what this vital spiritual experience is. And as I look at this and I think about this doctor, I think about the humility of this doctor. One of the top 3 psychiatrists in the world, having enough humility to say to Roland, with all my knowledge and all my skills regarding the mind, I've done all I can do for you. I can't help you anymore. You're going to have to be locked up or hire a bodyguard, or you're going to die from alcoholism. And Roland said, are there no exceptions? And this doctor had enough humility to say, yeah. Once in a great while, I've seen people like you have vital spiritual experiences. He said to me, they're phenomenal. I don't understand them, but I've seen it happen. It's in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are cast to one side and replaced with a new set of ideas, emotions, and attitudes. You know, this absolutely, it blows my mind to think about this. Jung had separated from Adler and Dr. Freud on one thing and one thing only. Adler and Freud thought all answers would lie within the mind itself. Jung thought maybe some answers might come through spirituality. Thank God that Roland didn't get to Freud or Adler. We'd still be sitting around psychoanalyzing ourselves today, which unfortunately many AA groups, that's what they're trying to do.